Picture this. You're a professional diver, alone, 37 meters beneath the surface of the Mediterranean Sea, off the rocky coastline near Marseille, France. You have just spent several minutes squeezing through a narrow, pitch-black tunnel carved into solid limestone, so tight in places that your tanks scrape against the rock on both sides. You have no idea where this passage leads, or if it leads anywhere at all. And then, suddenly, your head breaks the surface of the water, except you are not at the surface of the sea. You are somewhere else entirely, inside a chamber that has not seen open air in longer than human civilization has existed. You switch on your lamp, and for a moment you see nothing but darkness and dripping stone. And then, on the wall directly in front of you, illuminated for the first time in tens of thousands of years, you see a human hand. Not a real hand, a print. An imprint left by someone who stood in that exact spot, pressed their palm against the wall, and blew pigment around it sometime during the last ice age. That is exactly what happened to a diver named Henri Cosquer in 1985. And what he had just found, without fully understanding it yet, was one of the strangest and most scientifically important caves ever discovered on planet Earth. Stick with me, because what was eventually found deeper inside that cave includes images of animals that, according to everything we thought we knew about this region, simply should not have been there at all. If you have ever wondered what it would feel like to be the very first person in tens of thousands of years to see something like this, drop a comment and tell me, because I want to know whether that thought excites you or genuinely terrifies you. Because for the people who eventually explored this cave fully, it turned out to be both. And if you enjoy stories about discoveries that quietly rewrite what we thought we understood about the ancient world, subscribe now, because we cover exactly this kind of mystery regularly, and you will not want to miss the next one. Let's get into exactly what happened here, because the full story, from that first handprint to what scientists eventually cataloged deep inside this cave, is genuinely one of the most remarkable detective stories in modern archaeology. Henri Cosquer was not a treasure hunter, and he was not an archaeologist. He was a professional diving instructor running a small diving school near the town of Cassis, along the beautiful, rugged coastline known as the Calanques, a stretch of steep limestone cliffs and narrow inlets carved into the coast just southeast of Marseille. In the summer of 1985, while exploring the underwater terrain near Cap Morjou, a place he knew well from years of diving in the area, Cosquer noticed something unusual, a cavity cut into the rock face, sitting at a depth of roughly 36 to 37 meters below the surface. Curious, he ventured inside. What he found was a narrow submerged tunnel, later measured at somewhere between 137 and 175 meters long, depending on exactly how you measure its winding path, cutting directly through the limestone cliff. Over the following months and years, Cosquer returned again and again, pushing a little further into the passage each time, slowly working up the confidence and the technical preparation needed to go deeper into a completely unmapped, pitch-black underwater tunnel with no idea what, if anything, waited at the other end. Finally, sometime between 1990 and 1991, after years of incremental exploration, Cosquer and the divers accompanying him made it all the way through. And when they surfaced on the other side of that tunnel, they found themselves inside a genuine air-filled chamber, a real cave, sitting above the waterline, hidden at the far end of a passage that nobody could possibly access, except by diving through more than 100 meters of flooded rock. And it was there, in the beam of his dive light, that Cosquer saw that first handprint on the wall, and then, as he looked further, dozens more images. Animals, geometric markings, signs pressed into the mud and painted onto the stone by human hands during an era so distant that the entire geography of the coastline he had just swum out from did not yet exist in the form we know it today. Here is where the story takes a genuinely tragic turn, and it is worth understanding because it directly explains why the world did not learn about this discovery for years after Cosquer first found it. The passage leading into the cave is not just long, it is genuinely one of the most hazardous dives of its kind anywhere in the world. A narrow, disorienting, pitch-dark tunnel where a diver can easily become lost, especially if sediment gets stirred up and destroys visibility, which happens easily in a confined space like this. Cosquer, understandably proud and protective of what he had found, initially kept the discovery largely to himself in a small circle of trusted friends, rather than immediately reporting it to French authorities, which is technically required by law for any archaeological discovery of this kind. But in 1991, tragedy forced the issue into the open. 3 divers, attempting to reach the cave on their own, became lost inside that same flooded tunnel and died before they could find their way back out. It was only after that fatal accident that the existence of the cave and the extraordinary art hidden inside it was finally reported publicly and formally investigated by French archaeologists. To this day, the passage remains dangerous enough that it is completely closed to casual divers, and only a small number of specially trained researchers, operating under strict safety protocols, have ever been allowed to make the journey into the actual original cave. Once archaeologists were finally able to properly study what Cosquer had found, the scale of the discovery became clear, and it was staggering. Deep inside this chamber, researchers eventually cataloged more than 500 individual paintings and engravings, an entire gallery of Ice Age art that had been sitting completely untouched and unseen since prehistoric humans last set foot inside. Using radiocarbon dating techniques on the pigments and on charcoal remains left behind from ancient fires and torches, scientists determined that this art was not created all at once, but across two genuinely distinct periods of human activity, separated by thousands of years. The earlier phase of markings, largely consisting of hand stencils, dates back roughly 30,000 years, placing it firmly within the Gravettian period of the Upper Paleolithic. Then, after what appears to have been a gap of many thousands of years, during which the cave may not have been used at all, a second wave of activity occurred roughly 19,000 years ago during the Solitrian period, this time dominated by detailed painted and engraved animal figures. Altogether, the full span of human activity documented inside this single cave stretches across something close to 10,000 years, meaning the people who painted the later images were separated from the people who left the earliest handprints by roughly the same span of time separating us today from the very first walled cities ever built by human civilization. Now, let's actually talk about what those 500 images depict, because this is exactly where the story becomes genuinely strange, and exactly why the title of this video uses the word shouldn't. Cave art from this era, found across dozens of sites throughout France and Spain, tends to follow a fairly consistent, recognizable pattern. Horses, bison, auks, the massive wild ancestor of modern cattle, ibex, ancient deer species, woolly mammoths, and occasionally a cave lion or a rhinoceros. This is the standard visual vocabulary of Ice Age European art, documented over and over again at famous sites like Lascaux and Chauvet. And archaeologists studying this period have built an entire understanding of Paleolithic symbolism and behavior around exactly this recurring cast of animals. This cave contains plenty of those familiar species too. More than 200 depictions of horses, bison, ibex, and similar animals appear throughout the chamber. But mixed in among them, painted and engraved with the exact same skill and care as the horses and the bison, are images that simply do not belong in that expected catalog at all. Seals, auks, a type of seabird closely related to what many researchers believe may represent depictions resembling penguins, despite true penguins never having existed anywhere in the northern hemisphere. Fish. And strange, jellyfish-like creatures rendered in a style unlike almost anything else found in cave art from this period, anywhere else on the planet. Think about what that actually means for a moment, because it genuinely upends the simple assumption most people carry about cave art being purely a record of the land animals hunted by prehistoric humans for food. This cave, uniquely among the dozens of major decorated caves discovered throughout Europe, contains an entire secondary catalog of marine life, animals that would have required these Ice Age humans to travel to the coastline, observe genuinely different creatures living in a completely different environment, and then carry that visual memory back to this specific chamber to render it in pigment and engraved line alongside the familiar herd animals of the open steppe. No other major decorated cave from this era anywhere in the world contains anything close to this concentration of marine imagery. It is, quite literally, one of a kind, and researchers still do not have a fully settled explanation for why this particular group of people, in this particular location, chose to document these animals in a way that nobody else from this era apparently did. And then there's the single image that has generated more genuine debate among researchers than almost anything else inside the cave. A strange, partially engraved figure that some archaeologists have described, only half joking, as depicting the first documented murder in human history. The figure shows what appears to be a human-like form with the head of a seal, its body marked with lines that many researchers interpret as spear or weapon strikes. Nobody knows for certain what this image was actually meant to represent. It could be a shamanic figure, a hunter transformed into, or wearing the guise of the animal being hunted, a mythological being, or something else entirely that simply does not translate cleanly into modern categories of meaning. Whatever it was intended to convey, it stands as one of the most genuinely mysterious single images anywhere in the entire canon of Ice Age European art, and it exists nowhere else, in no other cave, anywhere on Earth. There's one more detail scattered throughout the earlier layer of handprints inside this cave that deserves its own explanation, because it connects to something that keeps showing up at other Ice Age sites across Europe and remains almost entirely unexplained. A significant number of the hand stencils found here, created by pressing a hand against the wall and blowing pigment around it to leave a negative silhouette, appear to show fingers that are shortened or missing entirely, as though the individuals who made these prints were missing fingers or had folded them out of view deliberately before pressing their hand to the stone. Researchers have proposed several competing explanations. Some suggest genuine physical mutilation, whether from ritual practice, from injury, or from frostbite in a genuinely brutal Ice Age climate. Others believe these images actually represent an intentional folded hand gesture, potentially forming an entire deliberate sign language or symbolic code used to communicate specific meanings between individuals, similar in concept to sign systems documented among various indigenous cultures in more recent human history. What makes this genuinely fascinating rather than simply strange is that this exact pattern of stencils with missing or folded fingers shows up not just in this cave, but at multiple other Gravettian-era sites scattered across Europe, suggesting this was not a one-off local practice, but potentially some kind of shared cultural code understood across a much wider Ice Age population, the actual meaning of which has been completely lost to time and so far to modern scholarship. Now let's step back and talk about the single most important scientific fact underlying this entire story, because it is genuinely difficult to wrap your head around, and it explains exactly how a cave full of prehistoric art ended up sealed 37 meters beneath the surface of the Mediterranean Sea in the first place, when the people who painted these images were actually alive and using this cave, roughly between 30,000 and 19,000 years ago. The entrance to this cave was not underwater at all. It was not even close to the sea. During the depths of the last ice age, so much of the planet's water was locked up in massive continental ice sheets covering huge portions of North America and northern Europe, that global sea levels sat roughly 120 meters lower than they do today. The Mediterranean coastline near what is now Marseille sat many kilometers further out than the modern shore, and the cave itself was located at the foot of a dry ravine, overlooking an open, grassy, steppe-like landscape, roughly 6 kilometers inland from the coast and sitting a full 120 meters above sea level at the time. This was, in other words, a completely ordinary, dry, accessible cave. Exactly the kind of sheltered spot Ice Age hunter-gatherers regularly used for shelter, for ritual, and for exactly the kind of symbolic art making found at more famous dry land sites like Lascaux. Then, as the last Ice Age gradually ended, beginning around 15,000 years ago, and continuing through a period scientists call the Holocene, global temperatures rose. The massive ice sheets that had locked up so much of the planet's water began to melt, and that meltwater poured back into the oceans. Sea levels rose steadily, gradually swallowing coastline after coastline all around the world, and the Mediterranean shoreline crept inland kilometer by kilometer, century by century, until eventually, sometime around 10,000 years ago, the rising water reached the mouth of this specific cave and began flooding directly into it. The lower galleries and lower sections of wall art, closer to the original entrance, were submerged first and have been lost entirely, dissolved and destroyed by direct contact with seawater over thousands of years. But because of the cave's specific internal shape, sloping upward from its entrance before leveling out into that larger interior chamber, a significant portion of the deepest section of the cave stayed above the rising waterline, forming a genuine air pocket, sealed off from the outside world by more than 100 meters of flooded, pitch-black passage that nobody on Earth would rediscover a way through for another 10,000 years. Understanding that mechanism is exactly what makes this discovery so different from famous dry land sites like the Chauvet Cave, also in France, which was itself sealed for tens of thousands of years and rediscovered in 1994, containing artwork dated even older than what survives at this site, in places pushing past 36,000 years. Chauvet was sealed by a landslide, a straightforward rockfall that closed off its original entrance and preserved everything inside in a genuinely undisturbed, pristine state, footprints and all, until researchers finally found a way back in through a narrow gap in the collapsed rock. This site was sealed by something far larger and far slower, an entire planetary climate shift, an ice age ending and an ocean rising to swallow the very landscape the original artists had walked across to reach the cave in the first place. Both caves ultimately achieved the same remarkable result, art preserved in something close to its original state for tens of thousands of years, completely undisturbed by any human contact in the intervening millennia. But one was sealed by a single geological event, while the other was sealed by the entire planet fundamentally reshaping itself around it, which is exactly why marine animals show up on these particular walls in the first place. The people who painted this cave were living through and adapting to one of the most dramatic environmental transformations our species has ever experienced, watching coastlines shift and entire ecosystems change within the span of human generations. And remarkably, some of that transformation appears to be reflected directly in the unusual mix of animals they chose to record on these walls. This is exactly the point in the story where the danger this site currently faces becomes genuinely urgent to understand. Because unlike Chauvet, which sits safely above sea level and can be carefully preserved indefinitely under controlled conditions, this cave's unique underwater location, the very thing that sealed and protected it for 10,000 years, is now becoming the single greatest threat to its survival. Sea levels are continuing to rise, driven now not by the natural end of an ice age, but by modern climate change. And researchers monitoring the site have documented measurable ongoing damage to the surviving artwork as water levels inside the cave's air chamber continue creeping upward year after year. Beyond the water itself, researchers have identified an even more insidious modern threat working its way into this ancient chamber: microplastic pollution. Tiny fragments of plastic, invisible to the naked eye but genuinely present in seawater virtually everywhere on the planet at this point, are being carried into the cave with each tide and each storm surge, settling onto surfaces that have remained untouched by any external contaminant for tens of thousands of years. Scientists studying the site now openly acknowledge that this remarkable, one-of-a-kind gallery of prehistoric art, having survived completely intact through an entire ice age, an entire planetary sea level rise, and 10,000 years of complete isolation from the outside world, may ultimately be destroyed within the span of just a few more decades by the combined pressure of continued sea level rise and plastic pollution. Two entirely modern, entirely human-caused threats that the original artists could never have imagined. Recognizing exactly this urgency, French researchers and government authorities made the decision to undertake an extraordinarily ambitious preservation project, using advanced digital scanning technology to create a complete, exhaustive, three-dimensional map of every single surface inside the original cave, capturing every painting, every engraving, every hand stencil, and every contour of the rock itself in painstaking photographic and laser scan detail. That digital data then became the foundation for an entirely new facility built directly in Marseille, open to the public in 2022, an exact, full-scale physical replica of the cave and every piece of art contained within it, allowing visitors to walk through a faithful recreation of the original chamber without ever needing to dive and without adding any further physical risk to the fragile, irreplaceable original site itself, which remains permanently sealed off from all but a small handful of authorized researchers. It stands today as one of the most technically sophisticated acts of archaeological preservation ever attempted, a genuine race against time to ensure that even if the original cave is eventually lost entirely to rising seas, the knowledge, the imagery, and the story it tells about these Ice Age artists and their strange marine-haunted world will not disappear along with it. There's one more layer to this story worth understanding, because it helps explain exactly why archaeologists were so quick to trust that what Cosquer had stumbled onto was genuinely ancient, rather than some kind of elaborate hoax or a later addition left behind by more recent visitors. When Jean Courtin, the French prehistorian eventually brought in to formally authenticate the site, first examined the cave in the early 1990s, he was looking for exactly the kind of physical evidence that cannot easily be faked. He found it almost immediately. Scattered across the cave floor were the remains of ancient hearths, charcoal deposits left behind by fires that had not been disturbed in tens of thousands of years, along with a small number of flint tools consistent with the technology of the Gravettian and Solutrean periods. Radiocarbon dating performed directly on that charcoal, rather than solely on the pigments used in the paintings themselves, provided an entirely independent line of evidence, confirming the same timeline the art itself suggested. When multiple, completely separate categories of physical evidence, charcoal from ancient fires, pigment chemistry from the paintings, and the geological history of the cave's own flooding, all converge on the same basic chronology. That is exactly the kind of layered, cross-checked confirmation that gives archaeologists genuine confidence in a discovery this extraordinary. It also helped enormously that the cave's remote, genuinely inaccessible location made the idea of some kind of elaborate forgery almost logistically impossible. Nobody could have secretly carried painting supplies and false artifacts through more than 100 meters of flooded, pitch-black tunnel to fake a discovery like this, which is part of why, despite the initial skepticism Cosquer faced from some experts in Paris, who doubted a diving instructor from the provinces could have found something this significant, the physical evidence ultimately spoke for itself. It is also worth understanding a little more about who these Ice Age artists actually were, because it helps ground a story that can otherwise start to feel almost mythical. The individuals who created these images were, in every meaningful biological sense, identical to modern human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, the same species reading this description right now, separated from us by tens of thousands of years of history, but not by any meaningful difference in raw cognitive or physical capability. These were not primitive, half-formed ancestors groping toward humanity. They were fully modern humans, living through an era of genuine hardship and extraordinary environmental instability, adapting to a world where the coastline itself could shift kilometers within a handful of generations, where megafauna like woolly mammoths and giant deer still roamed the open steppe, and where survival depended on an intimate, detailed knowledge of dozens of different animal species across radically different environments, from the open grassland to the rocky coastline. The sophistication visible in this artwork, The confident line work depicting animal musculature and movement, the deliberate use of natural contours in the rock to give certain figures a three-dimensional, almost sculptural quality, and the apparent existence of a shared symbolic hand gesture system spanning multiple, widely separated sites across Europe, all point toward a society with genuinely rich, complex cultural and symbolic traditions passed down carefully across generations, long before anything resembling writing, agriculture, or permanent settlement existed anywhere on the planet. That broader context also helps explain why researchers take the marine imagery in this particular cave so seriously as a genuine puzzle rather than dismissing it as some kind of decorative flourish or artistic embellishment. Every other element of Ice Age cave art that has been studied across dozens of sites throughout Europe appears to serve some combination of practical, spiritual, or ritual purpose connected to the animals that mattered most to daily survival, primarily the large land mammals that provided food, hides, bone, and sinew. If the seals, auks, and strange jellyfish-like figures in this cave followed that same basic logic, it would suggest these specific communities were drawing directly on a genuinely dual subsistence strategy, hunting and gathering across both the interior steppe and the retreating coastline, and considered both environments significant enough to document with exactly the same careful symbolic attention. Alternatively, if these marine images instead carried a more spiritual or mythological weight, closer to what many researchers suspect is happening with that unresolved speared seal-headed figure, then this cave may represent something even rarer, direct physical evidence of how a specific human community responded, symbolically and psychologically, to watching their entire physical world visibly transform around them, as the sea crept steadily closer to a homeland their ancestors had known as dry, open grassland. Either explanation, and quite possibly some genuine combination of the two, makes this cave a genuinely unique psychological and cultural record, not just an artistic one. Researchers are also careful to note that what survives today likely represents only a fraction of what this cave, and possibly others like it, scattered along the now submerged ancient coastline of the Mediterranean, may have once contained. If a single air pocket, protected purely by a fortunate quirk of the cave's internal geometry, managed to preserve 500 individual artworks against 10,000 years of rising water, it raises a genuinely tantalizing question about how many similar chambers might exist elsewhere along stretches of coastline that were themselves dry land during the last ice age, now sitting quietly beneath the waves, completely unmapped and undiscovered, simply waiting for the right combination of curiosity, technical diving skill, and sheer luck to bring them back into the light. Marine archaeologists studying submerged prehistoric landscapes around the world, from the Mediterranean to the Gulf of Mexico to the waters off Britain's own coastline, increasingly suspect that entire chapters of human history from this era remain hidden beneath the ocean, precisely because sea level changes of this scale happened repeatedly throughout human prehistory, and dry land occupied by our ancestors, tens of thousands of years ago, now sits in many places around the globe, well beyond the reach of ordinary archaeological excavation. Because stories like this one tend to attract a very specific kind of exaggerated claim online, and it is important to separate what has actually been verified by archaeologists from what circulates purely as speculation. Some corners of the internet have claimed that leaked documents describe unusually large or unexplained remains recovered from sealed caves similar to this one, remains some have gone so far as to describe using the word giants. It is worth being completely direct about this. No verified archaeological research from this site, or from any other properly investigated sealed cave, has ever confirmed anything resembling that claim. What archaeologists studying this specific cave have actually confirmed through careful, peer-reviewed, methodical scientific work is genuinely remarkable enough entirely on its own merits. 500 pieces of preserved Ice Age art, an entirely unique catalog of marine imagery found nowhere else on the planet, a haunting, partially speared seal-headed figure whose meaning remains genuinely unresolved, and a set of mutilated or intentionally folded hand stencils that may represent a lost language scientists have not yet learned to read. The real mystery here does not need embellishment to be extraordinary. The honest, confirmed version of this story is already one of the most remarkable windows into the Ice Age human mind that archaeology has ever produced. What makes this discovery so genuinely important, beyond the sheer visual spectacle of the artwork itself, is what it reveals about the people who made it and how they understood the rapidly transforming world they were living through. These were not the same isolated, purely land-bound hunter-gatherers we tend to imagine when picturing Ice Age Europe. The presence of seals, auks, fish, and those strange jellyfish-like markings tells us these specific communities maintained a genuine, sustained connection to the coastline and its marine ecosystem. traveling between the open steppe environment where the mammoths, bison, and horses roamed and the shifting, retreating shoreline where an entirely different set of animals lived. And the fact that people kept returning to this exact cave across a documented span of roughly 10,000 years, separated by generational gaps we can only estimate, suggests this location held some kind of enduring significance passed down and rediscovered repeatedly across an almost unimaginable stretch of prehistoric time. A sacred or culturally important site whose meaning was apparently remembered, or perhaps simply rediscovered independently, by people separated from each other by more centuries than separate us today from the fall of the Roman Empire. There is something genuinely humbling in recognizing that the last human beings to ever walk through the dry entrance of this cave, sometime around 19,000 years ago, had absolutely no way of knowing that within a matter of thousands of years, the entire landscape surrounding them would be swallowed by a rising sea, and that the images they left behind on those walls would then sit in complete darkness, utterly undisturbed, sealed away from every subsequent chapter of human history, through the rise and fall of every ancient civilization we study in school, through the entire span of recorded history, until one diver, working an ordinary summer afternoon off the coast of southern France in 1985, happened to notice an unusual gap in the rock and decided, out of nothing more than simple curiosity, to swim inside and see where it led. If a story like this genuinely expands how you think about how much of our own history might still be sitting out there, hidden, waiting to be found in places nobody has thought to look yet, hit like on this video. Because it genuinely helps put careful, well-researched stories like this one in front of more people, instead of letting the loudest, least accurate version of a story dominate the conversation online. And let me know in the comments, out of everything we just walked through, the marine animals that shouldn't have been drawn there at all, the mysterious speared seal-headed figure, or those unexplained mutilated hand stencils, which detail from inside this cave do you personally find the most unsettling? Because I have a feeling the comments on this one are going to be genuinely split. As it stands right now, this cave remains almost entirely inaccessible, sealed behind that same dangerous flooded tunnel that has claimed lives before, watched over carefully by a small circle of trained researchers who understand both its scientific value and its growing fragility. Every survey conducted at the site continues to document a landscape in genuine active decline. Waterlines creeping higher, microplastics settling deeper into a chamber that had remained perfectly, impossibly clean for 10,000 years before the modern world finally found a way to reach it, even without a single additional diver ever entering again. That is the genuinely strange, almost poetic tragedy sitting at the heart of this entire story. A rising sea protected this place for 10,000 years, hiding it completely from every war, every empire, and every century of human history that came after those final Ice Age visitors sealed their handprints into the stone and walked away for the last time. And now, that very same rising sea, driven this time not by a naturally ending ice age, but by our own modern world, may ultimately be the thing that finally erases it for good. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring discoveries like this one, places where the ancient world and the modern world collide in ways nobody could have predicted, because there are more stories like this still waiting to be told. Let me know in the comments what ancient mystery you want us to dig into next, and I will see you in the next one.